Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be marking the 30th anniversary Operation Desert Storm, known as the First Gulf War. Well, welcome to the program. And in today's program, as we discuss the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War, I'm joined by Major General Tim Cross, as well as retired Major Rhett Parkinson from the Armed Forces Christian Union. Gentlemen, warm welcome to the program. Firstly, I'll start off with you, Tim. It's an absolute honor for us to have you on the Middle East Report, and your very distinguished military career and background. But can you share with us when you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I think like a lot of people, certainly in this country, I was raised in what would be seen to be a Christian home, and went to church and did various things. But it was never a really important part of my life, is the truth. I then served with the United Nations in Cyprus in 1981. And managed to get a 4-day break over Easter, and got myself a couple of seats on a UN aeroplane that did the rounds in the Middle East at the time. In those days, there were quite a few UN operations going on around the Middle East, UN peacekeeping operations as a result of the earlier wars. And this particular plane was going from Nicosia in Cyprus, where I was, to Jerusalem. So Christine and I, my wife, went over there for 4 days just for a break and to be tourists, really. And we visited a couple of the tourist sites, Bethlehem and one or two other places. It was over the Easter weekend. And so on Easter Sunday, we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the service, which was a very good service. And afterwards, over a cup of coffee, somebody said to me, "Have you been to the Garden Tomb?" Well, frankly, I'd never heard of the Garden Tomb. But I do recall, as this chap chatted to me, passing a place outside the old city wall with a sort of rock that looked a bit like a skull. And one or two other things. So when he described it to me, I said, "Oh yeah, I think we walked past that." So he said, "Well, why not go over and have a look?" Which we did. We went around that afternoon. The guide that day, in the way that these things are, the good Lord looking after us, was a retired British Army colonel, artillery officer called Dobby, from a great Christian military family. And he took us around the Garden Tomb. This is back in 1981. Easter Sunday that year was my 30th birthday that day. And he took us around, talked us through the scriptures, particularly from John's Gospel, and explained how an old wine press, first century wine press outside the city wall, etc., that this could well be the place of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. And General Gordon, actually, who'd served in Khartoum, had been part of excavating the site over the years. And that was all great. And then this bit I remember, absolutely, I don't remember much from the past in terms of actual words spoken, but this bit I remember particularly. He said to me, "Look, this may or may not be the place. I think it is, and that's why I live here, and I'm a guide. But the really important issue is, if you go and look in the first century tomb, the tomb is empty." And feeling a bit stupid, really, I stood up and walked across to this tomb. And I remember thinking, what am I expecting to find? But I leant on the doorpost, looked inside, and it suddenly struck me that this was probably the most important question for anybody's life. And it wasn't quite a Damascus Road experience, but I went away back to Cyprus, mulled it over, gave it a lot of thought. And I thought to myself, this is an important question. You can't dodge it. You're going to have to make a decision one way or the other. And I made a decision for Christ. Very interestingly, from my point of view, Christine had been attending a Bible study group in Cyprus with the Padre. She was in the same position as me. She had actually become a Christian not long before this weekend, hadn't really discussed it with me in great detail. So we both became Christians at the same time as a result of a tour with the UN in Cyprus, and as a result for me of visiting the Garden Tomb. And it was, as I say, my 30th birthday. So being born again on a very special day.
Amazing, an incredible testimony. Thank you. And the Garden Tomb is a very special place, very peaceful, despite all the hustle and bustle of the Arab markets around. Tim, you've had a very distinguished military career. I mean, reaching the rank of Major General. You are very much a military commentator on military conflicts. Can you share with us something about your military background and some of the conflict zones that you've been deployed in, and also what it's like to be a Christian serving in the British Armed Forces?
Yeah, sure. Well, the truth is, I don't think I ever wanted to do anything other than join the military. I joined as an Army cadet in 1964, so that was barely 20 years after D-Day. And I went to an Army sixth form college, and I went to the academy at Sandhurst and did a 2-year course there before being commissioned in 1971. And over the next 36 years, I served in Northern Ireland as a bomb disposal operator in the 70s. I served in Germany 4 times during the Cold War years of the 1970s and 80s, which is a long story in itself, but a lot of people have forgotten about those years now. And then the UN tour in Cyprus, as I say, in 1981. And then in the 1990s, 3 tours in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Kosovo. The first Gulf campaign, which of course we're going to be talking a bit more about today. And then the second campaign in 2003, the more recent one, when I was in Baghdad in 2003. I was part of a coalition and the senior British officer in Baghdad. So I served in a number of operational theatres around the world, as well as serving in postings in France and in various other places around the UK. They were great years. I mean, it sounds a bit pathetic, really, but I loved every day of it. I loved the blokes. I loved where we were. I loved what we were doing. But it was also, and it was very exciting, of course, in many of these places. But the reality too is that you saw the reality behind the headlines, the gangsters, the protection rackets, the greed, the power, the hunger for power, and of course the brutality that flowed from the internecine warfare between religions and cultures and sex and all that stuff. And indeed, I saw the mass graves being dug up. So words like sin and evil are not interesting theological words for me. They're a practical reality of a broken and fallen world. And, that brings home the reality of a lot that we read about in the scriptures. And that time in Jerusalem and the subsequent script, when I read the scriptures and so on, one of the first things I had to decide, of course, when I became a Christian was, would I stay in the military? Because there's a sort of natural feel. A lot of people would say, well, you can't possibly be in the military because Jesus was a pacifist, basically, people would say. Well, I don't agree with that at all. And reading the scriptures, a lot of scriptural references to serving in the military. The lovely story of soldiers going to John the Baptist to say, what must we do to be saved? And John the Baptist doesn't say, leave the military. I've always felt rather sadly, he says, be content with your pay. Be content with your pay. Don't abuse your power, basically. And then, of course, there's Peter and Cornelius. There's Jesus with the centurion saying he's never found faith like that anywhere in Israel. There's the centurion at the cross who declares that this must surely be the Son of God. There's Paul's journeys and Paul's writings in which he uses a lot of soldierly language. And there's a very interesting passage in Luke chapter 22, which in a way reverses what Jesus has said earlier in Luke's gospel in chapter 10, when he says, I told you to go out without a bag and without sandals and so on. He says, this time you go out with a bag, go out with a sandal. And he actually says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And the disciples say to him, and this is in the upper room the night before his arrest and trial and crucifixion. He says, the disciples say, we've got 2 swords here. And Jesus says, okay, that's enough. But how you use swords in the context of a fallen, brutal world, in the context of people like Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, obviously Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, the rest of the hoods, around the world that do these terrible things, is another issue. And being a Christian in the military, having decided at that point that I wasn't a pacifist, and actually I felt very strongly called to stay in the military. It was then about how to use my Christian belief in my leadership and in the way that I commanded and in the way that we reacted on these deployments around the world. And the truth is, I never found it difficult to be a Christian in the military. Surprises people, actually, but there are a lot of Christians in the military, a lot of senior Christians, senior officers who are Christians. And I think that's a really good thing, because we would not want to have a military without any Christians in it. That's for absolutely sure.
Absolutely, and this is a great introduction now to Rhett, who is the head of the Armed Forces Christian Union that literally supports Christians serving on the front line in our armed forces. I've done a lot of programs with you, Rhett, and I'm a big fan of you and a big fan of the work you do. But for anyone watching this program that are not aware of the incredible work being carried out by the Armed Forces Christian Union, do you want to give them an introduction?
Yeah, Simon, thank you. Thank you for having me back on your program. It is always a pleasure. Yeah, Armed Forces Christian Union. In the military, we abbreviate everything. So the AFCU. Actually, we trace our roots back to 1851 when a captain in the British Army serving on the northwest frontier, so think the border area of Afghanistan, Pakistan, wrote home and said, please pray for me. To be a faithful witness and to hold on to Jesus as Lord and Savior, and for my soldiers who don't know God, don't know Jesus as Lord and Savior, and for the locals, they're pretty hostile. And you could say in 2021, not a lot's changed. We still have people in that area of the world. Many of our soldiers don't know Jesus as Lord and Savior. And those of us who are Christians need all the prayer we can get, particularly those who are still serving in the armed forces. So what do we do? Well, we're now tri-service, well, quad service actually, Army, Navy, Air Force, and civil servants in the MOD. We reach out to all of them. We're here to encourage those who are already Christians in the armed forces, and we want to help them live out and grow, develop their faith, to be salt and light, to through them to encourage others, like the colonel that Colonel Dobby, who spoke to General Tim, to come to committed faith in the Lord Jesus. So that's our first sort of mission area, if you like. And then there's a couple of others that work alongside that. We work for unity amongst Christians in the armed forces because of our long history and actually strong Christian heritage. We have a number of military Christian organizations who we partner with, and we are blessed in the United Kingdom Armed Forces to have chaplains in the Navy, Army and Air Force, and we very much work in support of them. We endeavor, as General Tim says, to provide a godly influence upon military culture. It's really important that those who are Christians, especially senior officers, hold on to that Christian heritage. And our values and our standards in all three services are very much arguably Christian. And the last thing is what I'm here doing really is exposing the role of Christians in the armed forces to the wider Christian community and in fact the wider secular community. We are men and women of faith, and that's important. And in fact, that's now encouraged by those in the MOD and in government.
Excellent. Well, you've got my support, my endorsement. You're doing a fabulous job, and so important to keep our armed forces, particularly the Christians, in our prayers, particularly when they've been assigned to conflict zones around the world. Tim, in this program today, we are actually marking the 30th anniversary of the start of Operation Desert Storm, or the Gulf War. But we have to put this conflict in its kind of historical context. The fact is that we saw in 1989 the fall of the Berlin Wall, together that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which broke up the world divided between capitalist America and Russia and the Soviet Union. We also saw that this was Saddam's forces invaded Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990. Why was it so important, particularly with George Bush as a US president, that America acted decisively to repel Saddam's forces from Kuwait and help to liberate that country from Saddam's oppression?
Yeah, it's interesting in that context, because what had gone on in the Cold War, of course, thankfully never developed into a fighting war, a hot war, if you like. In the end, the Soviet Union and communism collapsed, both in Russia and in the Eastern European states. And a lot of people at that point, and there were some famous references that were written, Francis Fukuyama and Huntington, who talked about, the end of history and the whole world is going to become capitalist and free and liberal democracy and so on and so forth. And I think, we in the West were feeling pretty chuffed with ourselves that we had won that campaign that had gone on really since the end of World War II. And I remember, chatting with fellow officers at the time. I was commanding a battalion in Germany as the Cold War came to an end and the Berlin Wall came down, and looking at one another thinking, what on earth are we going to do now? Well, history has shown that actually we've done quite a lot. But we then started to take a peace dividend in many of the Western countries. We thought that war had gone away, state-on-state warfare had gone. And this invasion by Iraq into Kuwait really took everybody by surprise. And it was a classic example of one state invading the boundaries and borders of another state, in the same way that Germany had invaded Poland or Belgium, in the same way that other interstate war had happened. And under the international rules, under Geneva, the United Nations resolutions and so on, this was a clear breach of international law. So it was very important, particularly in the context of trying to sustain the momentum at the end of the Cold War, that the collective world did something about it. And to be fair, the UN passed Security Council resolutions very quickly, demanding that Saddam pull his forces out of Iraq. And the Americans led the coalition, what was known as the Coalition of the Willing at the time, in what was initially, of course, Desert Shield, which was to stop the Iraqis going any further into Saudi Arabia and taking on the northern oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And we, the UK, deployed a brigade at that stage. It morphed into Desert Storm. We deployed the divisional headquarters and another couple of brigades, which I was part of. And then Desert Storm, as you say, started and was run through pretty quickly. We can come back to that in a moment. But that resolution and that resolve to stand firm against states invading other states and doing something about it was, I think, extremely important in ensuring world security, really, and it went well. Is the truth.
And Rhett, when we look back to over 30 years ago, when Saddam's forces invaded Kuwait, he then took control of 20% of the world's oil reserves, which could actually hold the West to ransom. Do you think there was a real fear that Saddam's forces could actually invade Kuwait, and that's why Operation Desert Shield was established, as Tim rightly said?
So I think the requirement to get troops very quickly into the Gulf was evident to all. He had brazenly taken Kuwait, and Kuwait at the time had about 10% of the world's oil supply. He already had at least 10%. And if he had carried on, he was pushing troops in those early days of August 1990, a lot of troops. He ended up pushing over 250,000 troops, over 300,000. Bearing in mind the Iraq army at the time was the fourth biggest army in the world. And the Saudis had a very small armed forces at that stage, quite not sufficient to really protect themselves against a aggressive attack. And all the maneuvering was and the signaling was that Saddam Hussein may not stop at the border of Kuwait, and had he carried on for another couple of hundred miles, he'd have had some of the biggest and key Saudi oil fields probably in the world. Certainly he'd have had over 50% of the world's oil supply under his control. And in addition to that, he would have also taken Al Jabaal, which was one of the key ports that we used to push the initial troops in, our armored brigade, but of course the Americans were moving in divisions, as well as carrier groups. They ended up with 6 carrier groups in the Gulf area, and so it was really important. And in fact, one of the initial very sensitive areas was having foreign troops in Saudi, bearing in mind it was such a holy site. And on the 6th of August, the Americans flew into Riyadh and went to speak to the king to get agreement that they could actually bring American troops into Saudi. And that was agreed. And very, very quickly, immediately afterwards, the Americans started pouring troops into Saudi to protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein's aggression.
And Tim, if we take ourselves back, I'm talking about the West here, the United States, and the Western world. We're very much backing Saddam and his forces against Iran with the rise of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And of course, we had that 8-year bitter war throughout the 1980s between Iran and Iraq. With hindsight, was it sensible to back Saddam Hussein, knowing that only a decade later we'd actually end up going to war against him?
Well, hindsight, of course, is a wonderful thing. And at the time, the sense was that the potential threat from Iran, and all that going on there was the greater threat. Saddam wasn't perceived to be a threat internationally at that stage. And he certainly wasn't seen to be a radical Islamist. He was, and in some respects, when you look at the people who made up his governing body, he had Christians working in his team. He had all sorts of other people, and he held together this Shiite, Shia, Kurdish, team of people. I mean, obviously brutally, and I'm not suggesting it was a good regime, but he wasn't perceived to be the threat. It was an 8-year war. It was a terrible war. I mean, Iraq and Iran both used the First World War tactics. They sent young men and women in lines, just as in World War One, and people were just mown down in their thousands. The casualty rates were awful, and there was strategic bombing and all sorts of things going on. So you could argue the West could have kept out of it, but the context of oil and all the other influences of the Middle East at the time, all had been going on in terms of the Arab-Israeli wars and so on. I think it's fair to say at the time people made difficult decisions. All choices, of course, carry consequences. I mean, that applies to me individually, to us individually, and to governments and everybody else in the world. Every choice carries a consequence. And by sustaining that regime with Saddam Hussein, we probably, we didn't help things for the future. And certainly the choices at the end of this first Gulf campaign had a big impact in terms of 2003. So I'm not one to look back in history and overly criticize decisions with people who are driven by events, making the best choices they can in the circumstances. And leadership, as I know, is a pretty lonely business sometimes, and you make the best choices that you can at the time.
Absolutely. And Rhett, if we look back at events, I think one of the key events of the 1980s was certainly the Israeli Air Force taking out Saddam Hussein's nuclear facilities in Osrink, in which the international community condemned Israel's actions. But the prospect then of trying to face Saddam Hussein, as you said, rightly so, had the 4th largest army in the world, but armed with nuclear weapons, would have meant a completely different scenario for the US-led coalition, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Israelis were fairly well briefed. The Iraqis were getting close to producing, or well on the road, down the road of producing nuclear weapons. It probably would have been a little bit longer, but nobody knows exactly how long these things take. I think what's interesting is he was, as General Tim says, a brutal dictator. And 1981, after initial early successes in 1980, where he was the one who went to war against Iran, and initially was very successful, mainly taking advantage of the chaos of the revolution and overthrowing of the Shah in Iran. By 81, 82, he was becoming quite desperate, and in fact, the reason he invaded Kuwait in 91 was he was bankrupt by the Iran-Iraq war. He'd run out of options. He massively underestimated, obviously, the desire to take the place back. I think what is interesting, again, hindsight, but in 1988, in 87 and 88, actually, not only was he using chemical weapons on the front line with the Iranians, but he used it in the Kurdish areas as well, and he gassed his own people. And there were various attacks on about 40 different villages, the worst of which happened on the 16th of March 1988 in a village called Halabja. And it was really trialing these different chemical weapons and measuring what concentration had killed the most number of people in different places. Well, a man who's prepared to do that to his own people, goodness knows what he would have done with a nuclear capability in his hands. But yes, it would have changed the equation considerably.
And Tim, we saw, according to my notes here, that on November the 29th, 1990, the UN Security Council passed a resolution that authorized the use of force against Iraq if they failed to withdraw from Kuwait by the 15th of January 1991. And then 2 days later, we saw the air offensive Operation Desert Storm was launched. And where were you at this time, and what were your thoughts when Operation Desert Storm was launched?
Well, at the time, I was just leaving the British Army Staff College to take over command of my battalion in Germany. Interestingly, my wife was about to produce my youngest son, Stephen, and I went over to Germany to take over the command of the battalion. I came back to England to see Stephen arrive in a little cottage hospital, and then took Christine and him over to a new country in a new house, and then abandoned her for 6 months or 8 months while I went off to the campaign. There's not many girls around who would be prepared to put up with that sort of thing today. Anyway, we'd taken over the battalion. I'd taken over in September. No suggestion. I had no suggestion, no idea that Iraq was going to invade Kuwait. But we have a ceremony for taking over command of battalions. It's only a 2 or 3 day process. Essentially, the old commanding officer leaves, the new commanding officer takes over. They have a chat for a couple of days, raise a glass of champagne, toast one another. The king is dead, long live the king. The old CO disappears, the new one's now in charge. And I had literally midday on about the 12th of September, I think it was, done exactly that. When I was summoned by the divisional deputy chief of staff, a great guy, who called me over to his office and said, "We think Iraq is about to invade Kuwait. Go away and think about what that means for the logistics of a campaign in the Middle East." Now, I said earlier that I'd become a cadet when I was 14, 20 years after D-Day. We had spent the next decades planning to fight a defensive operation in Germany on good lines of communication, lots of stocks of ammunition and fuel pipelines and all sorts of other stuff, great infrastructure. And now I was being asked to think about the logistics of getting a division 4,000 miles away in the desert on offensive, initially defensive and then offensive operations. And I literally dug out the books from the 1942-43 desert wars when against Rommel and all of that lot to work out all sorts of logistics stuff. And it was just a complete 18-hour days for weeks, sorting all this out, preparing to launch what was then 7 Armored Brigade, and then following on from that, the divisional headquarters, 4 Armored Brigade, a very strong artillery brigade, logistic brigade, engineer brigade, signals brigade, a whole raft of people, as well as the RAF and the naval contingents, which of course were deploying at the same time. In fact, the RAF got some capability out to Cyprus very quickly. And so it was just a very busy time. You had hardly time to think really, and you just focused on getting all the professional training you'd done in the previous 20 years really kicks in. And it was a fascinating time. Great fun in one sense, ironically.
I can imagine, but such a huge logistical challenge as well. Rhett, I was 16 when Operation Desert Storm was launched, and I became absolutely glued to the news coverage of this war, particularly because we just had constant news reports of what was happening. So it's really the first kind of media war that we'd actually seen where this was being played out on our news and TV screens. And then we saw the incredible military technology, such as the stealth bombers, the cruise missiles, the laser guided weapons as well. I mean, this was a kind of very modern, high tech warfare. How was the Gulf War different from other major operations, and how much did kind of technology play together with this huge buildup of troops? Something like 750,000 US led troops there, 500,000 American troops against Saddam's 300,000 troops based in Kuwait.
Well, I think it was the first sort of live war, as it were, fought on TV. I mean, I know there's some very stark images that came out of Vietnam and Northern Ireland and various other sort of campaigns and conflicts over time. But like you, I remember, watching TV as literally the Tomahawk cruise missiles were traveling down the street and being filmed live. In fact, I was doing a little bit of research for this, and the American Air Force were worried. Well, in fact, the air campaign people were worried on the first night. How would they know that the bombs had landed? Because the stealth aircraft were on radio silence. They didn't want to break radio silence or anything else. And so it actually turned out that one of their first targets was the telecom tower. And CNN were briefing live from Baghdad when everything went blank, and they went, "That's it. We've successfully taken out the communications tower." So the initial strike was successful. Yeah, I mean, a number of thoughts. I think the first thing is winning the hearts and minds, winning that campaign, and now it's on the internet, it's on social media platforms, and so much harder. Year on year to inverted commas control, or to get your media message across. And if you watch the development of the war, of the Gulf War One, at the beginning it's very much about shock and awe. It's about the precision nature of everything, individual missiles going into individual hardened hangars to take out the aircraft that the Iraqis weren't flying. We won within hours. We had sort of pretty much complete air supremacy. The Iraqi Air Force flew about 120 air sorties in the first 24 hours, and the coalition flew over 2,700. And it went down in terms of the Iraqis from there. So. But even the nature of the war was changing very quickly. You've got the Iraqis firing the Scuds, the Hunt the Scud battle that went on in the desert. The coalition, tragically, although it was a precision strike, I think they had intelligence that there was a communications bunker in Baghdad. They dropped a couple of smart GPS guided bombs, 2,000-pound bombs into the bunker, and it turned out, and they killed over 400 Iraqi civilians. And at that point, we sort of reined right back in terms of bombing the cities. We went after the army in the desert, who were very clearly identifiable, and there were clear targets that were not going to take media attention. And in fact, even the end of the war, after the 100-hour campaign, it came to an end before the Allies, the coalition, had achieved one of their two strategic aims. One was to clear Iraq, a Q8 of Iraqi soldiers. The other was to write down the Republican Guard divisions as the main sort of force backing Saddam Hussein. And they didn't really do that. And the reason was that the Iraqis were fleeing in anything and everything they could get their hands on: buses, trucks, cars. It wasn't just military hardware. Up the road towards Basra, and in a place called the Mutla Pass, became known as the Highway of Death, and over 2,000 vehicles were destroyed in a matter of hours. And it was such a devastating effect, and the concern was such of the media impact of that George Bush declared a ceasefire after 100 hours, 4 days. So media war was incredibly important. Technology, yeah, I mean, it was impressive. This was the war that was never fought in terms of the Cold War going hot, thankfully, but it was older Soviet era tanks and equipment and aircraft and so on against the very best the Americans could buy in terms of their B-1 stealth bombers, their B-52 bombers flying out of America direct all the way over and back again, and so on. So yeah, a very different kind of war. And the last big sort of state on state campaign, really, of the 20th century.
Absolutely. And Tim, can you share your experiences of being involved in Operation Desert Storm, and what was it like to be there and see this war unfold so quickly? Because there was, I think, a 42-day air offensive that was then followed by a 4-day ground offensive to liberate Kuwait from Saddam's forces. What was it like to be there? And can you share any stories that you can share with us all of that experience 30 years ago?
Well, it's a mixture of emotions, inevitably. I mean, we went in through Al Jubail, which is the port that Rhett referred to earlier on, and the Scuds were flying. And cut a long story short, for the first time in my life, I found myself putting on what we called our NBC suits, our nuclear, biological, chemical protection suits, for real. I mean, thinking that we might get hit with chemical weapons because he had used them, or indeed nerve agents. We were injected with goodness knows what to protect us from that. We were taking all sorts of tablets to protect us from chemical weapons and so forth. So, you know, we had practiced that sort of stuff for the Cold War years. But for the first time, for real, we were putting this stuff on, and it did dry the throat a bit, I can tell you. And a lot of people were quite quiet. And actually, there were Scud missiles that went flying past various places in the regions where we were. So actually, from my point of view, it was a big relief to get out of Al Jubail and get up into the desert. And by then, we had moved in the first Armored Division under command of a guy called General Rupert Smith, who was a fantastic commander, ended up as DSAC-er. And in fact, I exchanged emails with him only the other day. And we moved the division from Al Jubail up into the desert because the 1st Armored Division initially was being put under command of the Marines, the US Marines, and were going to take part in what was going to be the assault into Kuwait City. But we, for various reasons, which I won't bore you with, we transferred across to 7 US Corps under General Franks, and we became part of the flanking attack to go round the outside of Kuwait, go to the west of Kuwait, up to the north, and then, as Rhett referred to, take on the Republican Guard and hopefully destroy that. So again, Germany being what it was in terms of its infrastructure and build-up and so forth, I'd taken part in big exercises. I'd seen lots of movements of tanks and things. But out in the desert on what was known as the Tap Line Road, which was a single road running hundreds of kilometers, I remember sitting with the then Commander Medical, a guy called Lou Lillywhite, who ended up as a Surgeon General, the commander of the Equipment Maintenance Organization, a friend of mine called Andy Ashley, and myself, and an RAF officer, eating lunch by the side of the Tap Line Road, watching an armored division on the move. And it was an extraordinary experience. We're talking thousands of vehicles, taking hours to go past, in all sorts of configurations, tank transporters carrying tanks and armored vehicles traveling and so on. So just the scale, the enormity, and you've alluded to that in some of the numbers, but numbers mean something to most people, but it's only when you sit by the road and watch this lot going by that you begin to get a feel for the scale of what was going on. And those equipments, going back to the technology piece, these were the best equipments we'd had for a while. The Americans had the M1 Abrams. We had Challengers for the first time, AS-90, Warrior armored vehicles. These were very capable and good vehicles. We then moved them up, and from a logistic point of view, just getting that move done and sustaining it with the fuel requirements and all of the combat supplies and everything that went along with that. And then we waited whilst the air campaign completed, and just watching the air campaign from the ground, we could see the B-52s, the B-1s, all of the air campaign going on. There were airplanes doing big circles in the sky, and they were the refueling aircraft that went round and round in circles like a petrol station. And all of the fighters would come in and refuel, and the bombers would come in and refuel and then go back out and do their stuff. But on a slightly different issue, a great friend of mine who Rhett will remember, General Ian Jury, who was a wonderful Christian man, also served as part of 1st Armored Division. He commanded the artillery brigade, and a wonderful Christian guy. As I say, he and I had shared Bible studies together and so forth back in Germany. We met each evening when we could. In the moonlight, you could sit in the desert on a camp chair and read the Bible by moonlight. And Ian and I would sit together reading the Psalms and reading various aspects of the Gospels. And Ian would pray. He was a great prayer man, and he would pray obviously for us, but you know, and I took my lead from him, but he was the lead on it. He would pray for the enemy. I mean, as we were instructed to do, he would pray for the campaign. He would pray for the young Iraqi soldiers who were going to be caught with this stuff, this incredible amount of stuff that we'd seen. And so sitting in the desert on a camp chair by moonlight, praying and reading the scriptures and just supporting one another with other Christians that we knew around and so forth, again, is very, very vivid part of my memory. And then the move in and the 100 Hours War, and ending up on that road. I ended up with divisional headquarters on the road that Rhett referred to, the road of death. And ironically, that was the road that ran from Kuwait City to Basra, and we would be back there a number of years later, waiting to move into Iraq again, because, you know, the question was, did we do the right thing? Were the right choices made? Which you may want to come onto in a minute.
I will do. And Rhett, I just also think we have to really look at all the nations involved in the first Gulf War with Operation Desert Storm. Was commanded by the US Supreme Commander, US General Norman Schwarzkopf, featured 32 nations, including including the US, Britain, Egypt, France, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. And even George W. Bush talked about this being the new world order, and the consensus that these nations had gathered together to say that invading another nation is wrong, and we are going to liberate Kuwait from Saddam's forces. Saddam must have been very concerned seeing this huge army and nations gathered against him in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think the center of gravity, the key thing about the coalition was this conglomeration of, not just Western armies that had trained and spent time together in NATO, but actually the fact that you had Syrians there and Egyptians, as well as obviously the Saudis and Kuwaitis and so on, and they were quite, some of those were quite sizable. They were divisions, and in fact they were very successful. There was almost catastrophic success at the beginning with the Arab divisions and 2 US Marine Corps divisions punching their way into Kuwait, expecting only to go a few kilometers before taking too many, significant casualties. But in the end, the Iraqi soldiers had no heart at all. They'd been beaten up so badly. And in fact, the ground war, the main strike, which General Tim was part of, and 7 Corps, which was 6 divisions, half of which were armored divisions, were launched 15 hours before they originally planned, before their HR, when they were going to go. Yeah, and I think that's really one of the key things that Saddam was trying to do in dragging Israel into the war, was to break this coalition. And so within hours of the air campaign starting, he was firing Scuds into Israel, into Tel Aviv, and enormous pressure had to be put on Yitzhak Shamir, because the fear was, again, this. It's very easy to look back and go, oh, well, it was such a rollover. At the time, I was in Germany in 1990. I think it was 31st of August, a Friday afternoon in a cookhouse, when I was on attachment to an engineer regiment. Colonel John Morbick was lined up the whole regiment and said, right, you might not have heard of Kuwait or a bloke called Saddam, but one's invaded the other, and we're going to go and kick him out. And enjoy your weekend at home. The vehicles go in 3 weeks, we go in 6 weeks. And the Monday morning, everyone was immediately reaching for their NBC suits, the Survive to Fight, which was how to fight in a chemical, biological, environment. And so there was a lot of fear, a lot of, I know the engineers were looking at taking 60% casualties crossing the borders. That was kind of being talked about in that. So anything that they could do to disrupt the coalition, and particularly causing casualties and breaking the coalition by bringing the Israelis in, and that would make it very awkward for the Syrians, the Egyptians and others who were, sworn enemies at the time, to carry on fighting in a coalition. Hence the hunt the Scud campaign that happened in the desert, but that's another story. But yeah.
And Tim, it was on February the 28th, 1991, after 4 intensive days of fighting, that the US President George Bush called for a ceasefire. Do you think that was the correct thing to do, or should the US coalition forces, including British forces as well, gone deeper into Iraq to destroy the Republican Guard, and also maybe even take down Saddam's regime itself in Baghdad?
Yeah, it was was much talked about at the time. The short answer is I think it was the right decision. Although, as I said earlier, all choices carry consequences, and that decision carried a lot of consequences. But we must remember that the UN Security Council resolution was not a resolution to get rid of Saddam Hussein. It was not a resolution to invade Iraq. It was a resolution to get Iraq and Saddam Hussein's troops out of Kuwait, and that had been achieved. It was, as Rhett and you've just been talking about, a coalition of Arab nations. I would add that actually the Qataris had the largest contingent per capita, if you like, than any other Arab nation, and they were involved in the Kafji battle, which they're very proud of. I happen to know Qatar very extremely well. I was at Sandhurst with the then ruler of Qatar, Sheikh Hamid bin Khalifa Al Thani, who's a great friend. But the Arab coalition, I don't have any doubt at all, would not have held if we had said we're going to go into Baghdad and take down Saddam and his regime. The other issue, and Rhett has referred to this, is which was how much combat power did we allow them to get away with? And 100 hours was a political, it sounded great. It had a sort of, a media soundbite, if you like, to it. But there's no doubt that Saddam managed to get a lot of his kit out and a lot of helicopters that were then used against the Marsh Arabs and others against the Kurds and so on. I think the choice was right, but I think we should, in retrospect, have not allowed that much combat power to get away. And the political pressures on President Bush meant that he took the decision that he did. I mean, I remember leaning on a Land Rover on that Basra to that Kuwait City to Basra road, listening to the BBC World Service, waiting to hear whether or not we were going to go on. Funny enough, with John Moore-Bigg, who's I knew very well. But I was convinced at the time that it was the right decision. 12 years, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people have been, the Marsh Arabs having been almost ethnically cleansed, the marshes having been drained, the Kurds having been hit with chemical weapons, and all the things that flowed from that. We then ended up, doing it to Baghdad in 2003, which I was part of. So it carried big consequences, but I think it was probably the right decision at the time.
So we're down to the last 7 minutes of the program, so need to sum up this great discussion we're having, looking back at the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War. Rhett, we heard Tim talking about the aftermath of the Gulf War. Once George Bush declared a ceasefire on the 28th of February 1991. We actually saw Saddam go after the Shiite Marsh Arabs in a brutal way, as well as the Kurds in the north, which created a kind of no-fly zone in the north to protect the Kurds from Saddam's forces. And Saddam Hussein continued to be an international menace in the 1990s under Bill Clinton's administration, as well as our Prime Minister Tony Blair, in which they carried out major air sorties in September of 1998. What is your thoughts looking back at the Gulf War and saying whether this was a just moral war, and did the US coalition forces achieve their military objectives?
Well, I think General Tim sort of touched a little bit on it. The UN resolution was to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and that was achieved. The secondary military objective, certainly, I don't know if it was a strategic objective of the overall coalition, was to write down, was to destroy a large element of the Republican Guard, and that didn't happen. And I think the consequences were articulated well by General Tim. And I think things moved on. Bosnia was kicking off in later on in 91, 92, 93. We the whole ethnic cleansing, the deployment of the UN. The UN was united and resilient, particularly for that period, 1990-91, in a way that perhaps it hasn't been quite so unanimous in since then. But there was other things that came to the fore, which meant that arguably we took our eye off the ball, and things went south there. And also, of course, the whole build-up of the Taliban, who we'd never really heard of until 2001, 9/11, and that really sort of changed everything. It changed the whole perspective, or changed the American perspective of the world, and therefore, for all the rest of us, it changed our perspective. So yeah, I mean, there were lots of consequences. Some of them good. I think the fact that the UN was pulling together was a good thing. I, like General Tim, deployed in '95 to Bosnia during a very difficult period. You had the tragedy of Srebrenica. British troops managed to hold on. UN troops managed to hold on to Gorazde, but there was lots of things going on our back doorstep, and I think there was a lot of questions all the way after 1991. What purpose did NATO have? Now the Cold War was over, and this desire for a dividend of peace. British Army was cut very rapidly from 150,000 down to 102,000. We had options for change and lots of other direct consequences to us within the military world, as well as the wider political world.
And Tim, we have about 3 minutes left of the program, so I have to ask you your thoughts on the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War, but also, do you think we'll ever see a military conflict like this again?
Yeah, I suspect so. The heart of mankind hasn't changed much. I think state and state warfare has not gone away. I think Russia is a problem of weather. China is the equivalent of climate change. We're going to have some serious issues with China. So I don't think state on state warfare has gone away. Let me finish though with an uplifting story, perhaps.
Absolutely,
when
please.
When I went back into Baghdad I went to Baghdad in 2003. I was driving up to the Kurdish region, where they welcomed us as liberators of Paris. Really, I mean, it was an extraordinary time. But on the way, we passed a large patch of burning desert, and I pulled the Land Rover over, or my driver pulled the Land Rover over, and we went to chat to a couple of locals who were standing by this pitch. It was several rugby pitches in size, and it was over the top of the northern oil fields in Iraq. And I said to the locals through an interpreter, what's all this going on? They said, oh, well, this is burning gas from the oil fields below. They've been burning for thousands of years. But almost immediately, I mean, within a couple of minutes of the conversation starting, they said, oh, and this is the place that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, from the book of Daniel.
Amazing.
So I got my little Bible, which I carry with me all over all these operations, my operational Bible. I got out the book of Daniel and started reading it. And it was just fascinating to be in a country. I went and visited the potential site of the Tower of Babel, went to Nebuchadnezzar's palace near Babylon and so on. Iraq is an extraordinary place. And for all that's gone on there, I just, my prayer is that we will be able to explore, people will be able to go see these places and so on. And they were tremendous experiences. And Iraq, for all that's gone on, and I just hope that Iraq will pull itself out of the current turmoil, and we will all be able to go back over there and visit some of these places again and explore the Old Testament scriptures that refer to Nebuchadnezzar's palace and as I say, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Amazing
stories there, Major Tim. And Rhett, we're down to 30 seconds. So how can our viewers really support the incredible work being carried out by yourselves and others at the Armed Forces Christian Union?
Thank you. Well, some of us get to train and occasionally deploy on physical conflict, but we all get to play a part in the spiritual warfare that's going on around us. And the way that we do that is through prayer. And I would really encourage your viewers, if you have a heart or are interested in praying for the armed forces, go to our website. We try and put information, unclassified information, on ways that you can support us and many others across the countries, including Christians in Iraq and in Kurdistan and elsewhere, in prayer. So please do that. We will really value that, and thank you for your support.
So Major Tim and Rhett, thank you so much for being my guests on the Middle East Report today as we look back to the 30th anniversary of the start of Operation Desert Storm. And I want to thank you for watching this program today. It only feels like yesterday we saw this major international conflict in the Middle East. And thanks to our armed forces and that of the coalition forces, we saw that Saddam Hussein and his forces were expelled from Kuwait, and Kuwait was liberated. And this is just one of the very big stories that we've seen occur in the Middle East over the last 30 years. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.